Okay, could you please tell us about yourself and your book?
Yes, so I am an architect. I graduated from the École des Beaux-Arts in 1967, so it's a very long time ago. I was born just before the Second World War in June 1939. I'm a very old person. And so I studied architecture, and my main interest was architecture. And but then I was a bit dissatisfied with the studies in the Beaux-Arts in Paris. And I had a great admiration at the time for Le Corbusier. So Le Corbusier was building a new capital in India, Chandigarh, capital of Punjab. So I decided to go there. So I went there by land, hitchhiking my way from Marseille, my hometown, to India. It took me 3 months to get there. And when I arrived there, I get a job as a architect in Chandigarh. And to me, it was really a change because I had great admiration on the idea of Corbusier, but reading them in Paris, when I was in Chandigarh and living there, having a job there, I realized that many of those ideas were completely, utopian. What struck me, of course, is that the people were living were building Chandigarh. At the time, Chandigarh had 300,000 people. They could not afford to live in the city. They have to live in a slum. And so there was a slum, which was also about 200,000 people. And they were pushed, as the city grew, they were pushed outside the city. So I realized that this is really a complete mistake. The idea of the city as monument is not enough. So it completely changed my life in a way. I went back to the Beaux-Arts, finished my studies, but then I start working in a number of countries. And I move with projects. I had the luck to marry a wife who liked to travel as much as I did, and even with young children, she didn't hesitate to move from city to cities. Our three children were all born in different countries, and so we moved. And by looking at many different cities in the world with different culture, different economy, I thought that there was a lot of things in common. And that like human beings, we all have a different history. We have even different, slightly different genetic heritage, but we all have a heart, a lung, and a brain, hopefully. And so I think cities are like that, and it's a mistake to think that some cities are unique. So my book was about that. About I wrote my book rather late in life, only 8 years ago, and it was a summary of what I have observed and what I have learned. What I have learned is that as an architect, I have learned what I call regularities. That means that, for instance, densities decrease from the center to the periphery normally, not in Soviet cities, but in normally they do. That prices and densities are going together. High, there are high densities and high land price go together. It's really the land price will create the density, and a number of things like that. That people go to cities because they look for a job, not because there is a nice sewer system or even a monument. So I summarize this thing in my book, and so I distinguish two things in my book. That first, there is a spontaneous order. The spontaneous order is created by the people who are living in the city. The way they go to work, what they like to do, if there are a lot of restaurants or not, this and where the restaurants are is a spontaneous order. It reflects culture, it reflects the desire of the people who live there. Urban planners do not control that, but they have to monitor it to understand why it is that way, why there are restaurants in one area and not in another or something like that. So this spontaneous order, I think, is the most important thing in the city. However, urban planners have to serve this spontaneous order by creating infrastructure to allow citizens to go from one part of the city to another. Again, a city is a labor market. A labor market means that you have to circulate between one area to another. So this is top-down. So you see this mix of top-down. If you build a metro system, or a sewer system, it's a purely engineering thing. You do it top-down. The market is not involved in it. But you have to take into account the people preference, and the sewer has to serve the way the people distribute themselves in the city, rather than to say, to have a more efficient sewer, the people should be distributed that way. You see, that's an important thing in my book, this dual thing of a spontaneous order represented by market, and then the top-down infrastructure and regulation that urban planners impose.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Second question, what mistakes do architects and urban planners make when they ignore market mechanisms?
Well, again, market mechanism is a substitute in a way for spontaneous order. Markets are created by the people themselves. If an area is expensive residentially, it means that a lot of people want to live there. So it, in a way, the market is a proxy for the will of the people. So too often architects and planners ignore that. They think that a city is a bit like a smartphone. That if you have a very smart engineers or architect, they will design a perfect utopian city. There is no such thing as a utopian city. Things change constantly. So cities have to evolve constantly. So you have to, architects have realized that they just look at trying to serve, again, this spontaneous order by designing the right infrastructure, and especially be very careful about regulation. A lot of regulation imposed by planners eliminate a lot of poor people from the city, and people who are working in the city. That like was the case in Chandigarh when I was working, where all the people who were in the slum were not unemployed. They were working very hard. They were plumbers, they were electricians, they were masons, and they were eliminated from the city. They were eliminated from the city because of architects ignoring market. They thought that designing nice houses is an end in itself. Designing houses is for very specific people, and so they have to afford the houses.
Well, thanks. What economic principles could be useful for the development of Belarusian cities?
So I have never been in Belarus, unfortunately. I would like to visit Minsk one day, but I don't know when. I have been, I've worked extensively in Russia from the 90s, and I started in, the last days of Gorbachev. And then my last visit was in 2015, I think. And but I work mostly in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And I think that here already, the mistake of the past, in my opinion, was much too large industrial area. And the industrial area were developed also at the time of Stalin, or even I think at the time of the Tsar, some of them. And they were very close to the city center. And because there had no land prices, they were never recycled. When you have a market, it's a market for recycled land. If you have an old factory which should not be there anymore, it's a price of land, which is a mechanism which make that an entrepreneur will come and say, I will build an office building there rather than a factory. So I think that the problem that I saw in Moscow and St. Petersburg was that there was a lot of very, very old use of land, which was completely irrelevant to modern Moscow or modern St. Petersburg, which are mostly services, and that this land has never been recycled. So the way to recycle is, I think, the main problem. And then there is a question of affordability. There is a tendency also for, I think, former Soviet planner to to design building in terms of just technology. And, like, for instance, panel housing and things like that. It's an interesting technology, but usually it's not necessarily what people want, and especially in some area. So I think to recycle those building is also very important. I have seen recently example of, I thought for a long time that panel housing could not be recycled, that it was too rigid as a structure. But I have found in Prague, building which were recently, just last year, building which were built at the time, of where Prague was part of, the Soviet sphere, and those have been in fact rehabilitated. They spend a lot of money on the design and things like that, and they are now very nice housing. So I think this is a part of thing. But again, there is this question also in former Soviet cities of the density. The density of people tend to increase in the periphery. They are relatively low in the center, increase in the periphery. So I have a graph to show that. For instance, could I use this graph here? Let's see. Can you see it now? No.
No.
Okay. Let me get back. Yes, you see, so horizontally here, I have the distance from the city center, from 0 to 30 kilometers. And vertically, I have the density in people per hectares. In blue here is the density of Moscow in 1992. And the red line is the density of Paris, over the same distance. So you see, you have here a reverse density. And by the way, all market cities in the world have the same profile of Paris. I'm not putting Paris as an example of a good city. It's just that market produce this type of thing. So you see, the highest densities are in fact at 20, 30 kilometers, because it was a time of Brezhnev where they were building very tall panel housing. So that resulted in the densities, because they were not using land prices to decide what is the height of building. So this is an illustration of the problem. The problem with that is that as you imagine that cities are labor market, it means that if you have a structure where the city has density increasing with distance, it means that the distance of people to their work is much higher than if you have a density like Paris or any other market cities. Again, what it shows here is a complete lack of spontaneous order in the Soviet system. And the result, it changed completely the shape of cities. By the way, I wrote a report about that, which was translated into Russian. I can send you the Russian. It's called Cities Without Land Market. So I have a Russian version of that. I could send it to you.
Yeah, it would be nice.
Okay, next question. Is Soviet legacy wide avenues, mass housing, lack of flexibility, an obstacle to market development in urban space?
Well, I've been very critical of Soviet system, but I think the wide avenue are not the problem. I think it could be an asset if they are well designed, well planted, and usually they are, by the way. I think that they allow mass transit very easily. Also, in general, well, I'm talking about, again, St. Petersburg and Moscow. The mass transit is very good, and this is an asset if you consider that a city is a labor market. So this is a big asset that you have, and the metro in Moscow is much better than the metro in New York, so that's an asset. Let's face it. This is something you can play with. No, I think that the only question which is difficult to solve is, again, this reverse of densities. So when I was in Moscow the last time, I saw that this was attenuating. The density was more flat rather than increasing with the periphery. They are developed. So they have. So I don't know how is it in Minsk. I have no data on Minsk, so I don't know. But I assume that the same thing happened. I assume that you have a land market in Minsk. The way it exists in St. Petersburg and Moscow. So again here, I don't think it's a irreversible problem. I think some part of the design of the Soviet system is an asset, and some is something that you have to correct to reflect more and especially the modernization of the city, where many activities are in fact services. They are not industries anymore. Industries are pushed back, in smaller cities, and again because of land prices. So I think that it's something you have to pay attention to, but in general, it's not. It's not a very. It can give also to the city a very special personality in a certain way.
Okay, thanks. Do post-Soviet cities have unique characteristics that require a different planning approach compared to European or American cities?
I think it's recycling of land. The fact that there were no market for a long time, you have a lot of land which is used for a use which is obsolete. For instance, and that I think sometimes is difficult to do. I remember a case in Moscow at the time I was working for the World Bank, and the Russian have asked us to finance. They had in the center of the city a big coal depot. That came from the time of the Tsar, I suppose. So they wanted, during all the Soviet time, there was no way to remove this coal depot and to put it in the suburbs. So it was creating a lot, in particular, in terms of environment, it was pretty bad. So they asked the financing of the World Bank to move it. There was no, at the time, the city has no resources to move this coal depot. So I assume that now, because you have a market, you can use the price of land to finance the move of obsolete building. But I think that's something you have to, it requires land use change sometime, because maybe the zoning is industrial. And I think that's probably I think that's a major problem, and the difference between, let's say, market cities and former Soviet cities. This recycling of land. The recycling of land is what creates, productivity and innovation, by changing the use of land constantly. So that, I think, is a major problem, and you should have mechanism to do that, again, to finance it. It costs money to recycle land, but at the end, you have a much more efficient land use.
Thanks. In the first question, you mentioned the Le Corbusier, and we have a question related to this famous architect.
Yes.
Why do famous projects like the Belarusian plan, Brasilia, and Chandigarh, and others fail from an economic perspective?
Because they were utopian. What is in utopia? Utopia is something I have in my brain, and I say, I'm a very smart architect. I'm going to design something which has never been done. So if it's a monument, it's fine. Doesn't matter. Maybe it's good. If it's a city where people have to live and work, I have no right to do that, because I will force people to live in things which are a fruit of my imagination, but they never ask me to build a house for them. It's the government who asks me, but not the people who live there. So thank God the Plan Voisin of Corbusier was never implemented. It was most of the dreadful thing I have seen. But it was his idea. So people are free to have their idea. What they are not free is to impose them on people. If you are an artist and you have a sculpture or a painting, and Nobody like that. That's all right. You are not imposing it on everybody. If somebody buy it, there's this person likes it. So we have to make a difference with a city. A city, you impose a city on people, and so Brasilia was the same thing. The Costa. I remember the manuscript of Costa when he described. Costa was the planner of Brasilia. Niemeyer was the architect. So Costa say, the city that I invented. You don't invent cities. You give shelter to people. You provide an infrastructure so they can build the city themselves. So you see, this is the idea. And also, there is an implication in the Plan Voisin or Brasilia, is that a city reach a permanent optimum. It's the best city possible, and forever. Now, we change, economy change, technology change constantly. You cannot pretend that you build a city which is so perfect that you don't want to change it. You see, if Michelangelo designed a fresco in Rome, this is a permanent optimum. You don't want to change it. You don't want anybody to change it. You want to preserve it. But a city is not at all like that. A city, Jane Jacobs wrote that. A city is not a work of art. A city is, it could be beautiful. Moscow is beautiful. St. Petersburg is beautiful, but it's not a work of art. It has to evolve. So you have to make a balance between some remnant of the past, like St. Petersburg or Moscow, a historical neighborhood that should be kept. But then at the same time, there should be a possibility of reorganization of the city in some area in order to adapt to new things. So that was wrong with the approach of Brasilia, Chandigarh, and and the Plan Voisin. But Corbusier was particularly bad about it. He thought he was a guru. It was a bit like a cult. And I remember myself, in a way, I was part of this cult as a young student because I was without any experience. And just reading the book of Corbusier are not enough to admire him. You have to look at many cities and see how absurd these ideas are.
Okay, thanks. Is it possible to imagine a city designed entirely based on economic models without the involvement of architects?
No, absolutely not. Economics is, excuse me, economics is only a parameter you have to take into account, but it doesn't design cities. You cannot design cities. In my book, I think I have an example of a city, a neighborhood in Cairo, which is completely spontaneous. And so the streets are all very narrow, and the houses are not bad, but the streets are terrible because the people would develop it, and that was purely market. There were no regulations at all, no design in advance. The neighborhoods are such that you cannot communicate from one neighborhood to another. You have only 6-meter roads. So you need absolutely a designer to design the network of streets. That you need also a designer who will decide where the parks will be, the open space, what economists call public good. The market is not going to do that. For instance, say, in St. Petersburg, along the Neva or the Moskva River in Moscow, you have a garden around them. The market itself will, in fact, the price of land there will be very high if you let it on the market. So you could imagine if you let only the market work, economic force work, you will have apartment right on the river, and nobody in Moscow or St. Petersburg will be able to see the river ever. Only the people who have this. So you see, this duality is very important to understand. Now, economics is still very important, but design and the top-down, the separation of what is public and what's private is entirely a design exercise. There is no mathematical rule which tell you what to do. So you try to for instance, for the width of street to take into account communication, a bus lane, a bicycle, whatever. But you never know that you will be right 20 years from now. So the best way is just to design. You have to design it. There is no substitute for design. So don't think that it's just let the market. No, the market has a role to play for individuals. When they select a house, or large it should be, or high it should be, the market should decide that. But the layout of a city is entirely designed. And of course, what is important is that when you have private lots, that you give the lots to private developers and private architects, and not have one architect. The terrible thing with plan voisin is that you have one architect for 100 buildings. You should have the architects should compete with each other too, so you have more creation. And some architect maybe will design terrible building, but because there are many architects, then the terrible building will not be imitated and the good building will be imitated, kind of a Darwinian process. So again, this idea of Brasilia was one architect. Niemeyer was the only architect for all Brasilia. Later, of course, in the suburb, there were other architects, but the core city of Brasilia is designed by only one architect. I think it's a terrible thing. Even Niemeyer was a good architect, by the way. I consider him a good architect. But to have one architect design an entire city is a terrible mistake.
So, Oscar Niemeyer, my favorite architect.
No, he's a very good architect. And
Yes.
I have visited all his buildings, not only in Brasilia, but in other part of Brazil. And well, he has one building in Paris, by the way,
Yeah.
the Communist Party headquarters.
Yes. We know. Thank you. And next question. What skills do you think will be most important for architects in the coming decades?
To adapt to new technology, in particular, transport technology is changing very much. We pay now more attention to walking and bicycling. I am not saying that bicycling is going to the major way of transport, no, but so there are many other modes of transport which we have to be taken into account. For instance, Uber. I don't know if you have Uber so it's a new mean of transport which I think has a lot of future because you can share it also. It's more efficient. You will have also very soon self-driving cars. In LA, we don't have it yet in New York, but in LA, I have taken several times self-driving cars, with no drivers, and it's really wonderful. And in the future, it will be much cheaper. So we have to adapt to this, to these things. So that the other thing, which is completely different from all my career, and I tell that to my students when I see them, is the change in the fertility of women. This affects many cities now have a labor market which is aging because there are less and less young people. The first countries which were affected by this low fertility were Japan, South Korea, and to a lesser extent Singapore. So I studied them very carefully to see what happened. What happened in Japan is that all the young people in the smaller cities, which are quite nice actually, are moving to Tokyo because they don't want to be in a city where the restaurant closes at 7 o'clock because the majority of people are old and they go to bed at 8 o'clock. So they want also, they know they will get better jobs in a big city than in a smaller one. And for the first time, I see now more country. Thailand has the same problem. All the young people from the smaller city are moving to Bangkok. Bangkok is 12 million people. The next city in Thailand is 700,000. And they are less young being born, but the few who are born there, they leave. So you have a city which is aging even faster than the low fertility of women should imply. So this is a problem I have never confronted before. When I was in Japan, a mayor invited me to give my advice, and when I look at the number and the births, I told him I'm completely incompetent. I don't know. I hope so. You guys are young. You will have to deal with that. I'm sure that in Belarus, you have this problem of low fertility already. I am not sure if it affects yet the migration between small city and large city, but you will have to take that into. It's a new problem, and I don't think it's going to change very fast. I mean, I have an economist friend in the Mercatus Center who think that it may be reversed within a few years. I don't see any evidence of it yet. Why it happened, there is a mix of reason. Many governments are trying to encourage, women to have children by having more leave, free baby care, convincing their husband to do more homework, work in the house. It doesn't work. Or give money. It doesn't work.
Okay,
So
thank you.
this is a new problem. And again, I'm completely incompetent to give you a solution.
Okay,
Yeah.
understand. And last question, in your view, how has architectural thinking changed in recent decades? Are these changes positive?
Yes, in general, I think that if you have more competition between architects, if you draw architects from a wider group of people, when I was at the Beaux-Arts, there were no women architect, student architect. For some reason, it was considered it was not a job for women. And now I think that, at NYU in architecture, there are slightly more women than men. And I think that, if you include more people in the profession, in all the profession, I think it's good. You have different point of view, different, and again, architecture is it's a competitive endeavor. You do something, you cannot test a new building on a model, really. I mean, in a laboratory. So you build it, and you hope it will work. It's so some will fail, some will work very well, some will be just okay. But I think again here you have a Darwinian process. When something is successful, people tend to imitate it, and imitation in this case is a good thing. So again, what is very positive in the last few years is this opening of culture also. I see in New York, I see architects who are from India, others from Africa. They are. I think this is a very good thing. So that's a nice tendency. I think too that it's easier now to have access to, if there is a change in technology, building technology, it's much easier to access it now than it was when I was much younger. And technology spread much faster. See, for instance, in the 1900s, where for the first time architects has to work with engineers. For instance, the big building in Paris, built in the 1900s, for instance, the Grand Palais, the roof has to be done entirely by engineer. Was metal, it's done by engineer, but the walls were done by an architect. And at the time, they refused to talk to each other. And this do not, the progress we have done now, that we can work with a lot of different people. Sociologists, painters, sculptor, engineers, and engineers again of different, engineers who are very good at all the plumbing system and other elevators and things like that. So I think this is a very good thing. It's very positive. But we need communication, and what I fear now, because the last 2 years and is there is a mondialization. The easy circulation between country is stopping. I used to go to China all the time. I have many Chinese friends. We used to exchange a lot of data. There is a wall there now. I cannot, even the professor were translated my book into Chinese, a Chinese professor, a very eminent professor. And at the set, he wanted me to give talk to his student on Zoom, or even come to China again, and then suddenly send me an email and say, I apologize, but it's not a good idea for me to exchange email with an American. So this is bad, this is a bad tendency. And I hope it doesn't happen between our country and yours, or Russia, or thing like that. I see the split, I hope it doesn't. So this is what worries me for the future.